Hi, everybody. This is Nancy Bro. I am the office manager at GAR Cemetery in Miami, Oklahoma, and you are listening to the Route 66 podcast.
Route 66, Route 66, right along with the Route 66 podcast. For talks with people living and working along the Mother Road. The main street of America, from Chicago to LA, bore a heavy, heavy load. Route 66, Route 66. Sometimes historical paths aren't discovered until they're lost. Right along with the Route 66 podcast.
Hello and welcome aboard the Route 66 podcast, where talks with people living and working along the Mother Road. I'm your host, Anthony Arno, and I'd like to thank you for joining us here today on our journey. A very special thanks to my Patreon business supporters, including the Midpoint Cafe, Gilligan's Route 66 Tours, and our newest supporter, the Jack Rabbit Trading Post. They not only support the podcast, but also the Route 66 Scholarship Program as well. I hope you were able to listen to last month's episode, featuring nothing but my talk with the country's noted scholar on the Tulsa race riot that took place exactly 100 years ago. A bit before the route was launched, that episode featured no jingles, no commercials, no trivia, no contests, no listener feedback, no promos, no news, nothing but just the story of an event that took place that I'm constantly hearing from listeners, how come I never heard about this? On my next episode, I'll feature a legend still living and working along the road, even today after 50 years. Yes, that's 50 years, and I'll play a clip of that episode at the end of today's show. Today, we visit a local cemetery in Miami, Oklahoma, pronounced Miami, where 15 British Royal Air Force cadets are buried as a result of training accidents while training here in the United States during the early days of World War II. That's 15 cadets and a very special woman who literally adopted these young men by taking care of their graves for decades to come. Her last request was to be buried alongside those boys, her boys, and her request has been honored. Route 66 News. The city of Catoosa, Oklahoma is scheduled to give the blue whale a cleanup, complete with paint and repairs on the skin of that 80-foot marvel. You can find out more about the blue whale on episode number 32. The Route 66 Co-op finalized the cleanup of the Painted Desert Trading Post. You can see before and after pictures on our website at route66podcast.com. More on the co-op can be heard on episode number 37 with Roman Rich. The Miles of Possibility Conference will be virtual this year, taking place the weekend of October 21st through the 24th. And the U Drop Inn in Shamrock, Texas is once again serving food after a 25-year break. Listener feedback. You know, I hear from a lot of people traveling the road, both young and old. But today I want to share with you a new listener here on the podcast, her recent journey along the Mother Road. I have one of our newest listeners on the line here. Megan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I understand you recently took a trip on Route 66. Tell us some of the highlights on the trip.
Yeah, so my now husband and I drove the entire route in September. Started in Chicago where I grew up and then drove to Santa Monica in about 2.5 weeks. I love world's largest things, so we had to stop at all of the giant attractions along the way. We loved the Totem Pole Park and some of those and seeking out just a ton of muffler men. And then we also got to stay overnight in an Airbnb in Oatman, which was really fun to get to hang out there for a little bit longer than we had planned. And then at the end in Santa Monica, we actually eloped. So we got married on the Santa Monica Pier and took our elopement wedding photos.
How cool is that?
Sign.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was a blast.
And where exactly did you stand, Megan, on the pier?
We stood under the end of the trail sign.
And we have that picture that we'll share with our listeners. What a great story to tell your children and your grandchildren. What a great memory of Route 66. Now, your fiancé, was he always a Route 66 fan, or did you have to twist his arm?
I didn't really have to twist his arm at all. We've been together for more than 6 years now, so he's very used to me being the person who wants to take a 5-minute detour that turns into a 3-hour detour.
That sounds like a Route 66 fan. Tell my listeners about your blog for the state of Iowa.
Yeah, so I went to journalism school. I have a journalism background and have a travel blog called Olio in Iowa, where I write about offbeat attractions and world's largest things and Midwest and beyond travel. It's really fun to get to share some of the quirky things around the Midwest and now share even more about our Route 66 trip there.
Megan, it was great talking to you. Good luck. What's your husband's name?
Joshua.
Okay, say hi to Josh. Bye, Megan.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, this past summer, I traveled the western half of Route 66, from Santa Fe to Santa Monica. Now, you know I travel the road every year, but this year was very special. I had my family with me, and we got to experience the road that Daddy has been fascinated with for quite some time. It was an incredible trip. Highlights included staying at La Fonda on the Square in Santa Fe, a side trip to Las Vegas, New Mexico, to eat at La Castaneda, and seeing the annual Solar Car Challenge with schools such as MIT and Georgia Tech racing cross-country. The Alvado for lunch, and I had to check out the note that was buried in the wall during the 1930s construction that my guest on episode 29, Chad Reneker, spoke about. El Rancho Hotel in Gallup, Painted Desert National Park, seeing the Painted Desert Trading Post and just drive along that dirt road to get there. Just letting my imagination run wild with what it used to be like in this area that today is miles from the nearest paved road or any other buildings. If you're ever in that part of the country traveling Route 66, I invite you to visit the Painted Desert Trading Post. I know they would appreciate any donations from visitors who take the time to visit a true icon along Route 66. The Wigwam Motel in Holbrook, Cindy at the Jack Rabbit Trading Post, standing on a corner park in Winslow, Arizona, La Posada, and dinner at the Turquoise Room. And you know, behind La Posada, there's an art museum, which no one really knows about. I was there in August, and only 3 people signed the guest registry during a time when the hotel itself was sold out. That's the Winslow Arts Trust, hosted in a separate building behind La Posada. Twin Arrows, 2 Guns, a side trip to the Grand Canyon, and biking along the road on a section that's closed to motorists during the summer months. Mary Coulter's Watchtower, Seligman, Arizona, Cool Springs, Sitgreaves Pass, and sharing with my wife the story of cars being driven in reverse over the pass before the days of fuel pumps. Huckleberry General Store, Giganticus Heticus, El Trovatore Motel in Kingman, where I met Sam and his wife. The drive through the Route 66 Shield, the Powerhouse Museum, Mr. D's, the Wild Burrows of Oatman, the Fred Harvey train station in Needles, Goffs, Nicole at Amboy, and just looking at the map and all the towns around the area with her. Route 66 museums in both Barstow and Victorville, the McDonald's Museum in San Bernardino, Rancho Cucamonga, the original end of Route 66 in Los Angeles, the Georgian Hotel in Santa Monica, and the hostel as well. Hey, if you're looking for an inexpensive place to stay, just 1 block from the pier, A shared room with a private bathroom was only $65. Now, if you're familiar with the hostel movement, this building itself was really cool. What is the oldest brick building in Santa Monica has served as a tavern, the town hall back in 1867, an art gallery, and even the West Coast location for the Vitagraph Film Company in 1911, which was one of the first film studios to relocate from the East Coast. Vitagraph later became part of Warner Brothers. The Santa Monica Pier and meeting the staff at the 66 to Cali gift shop, which we had on our show recently. Biking 43 miles from Santa Monica through Venice and Muscle Beach, Marina del Rey, El Segundo, Hermosa Beach, where I stopped to see John Pugh's mural. John was a recent guest here on the show as he painted the mural in Winslow, standing on the corner park. Redondo Beach and Torrance. You know, I'm originally from New York City and I grew up going to the Jersey Shore, but that ride, even though it wasn't directly on 66, was really interesting. From seeing people hang gliding on the beaches for a 30-second thrill ride, to parks with trapeze artists and people rollerblading, to Tech Bowl, which I had never heard of, which is playing soccer with a regulation-sized soccer ball on a curved ping pong table. Wild stuff. So I did that from the pier and back, 43 miles on an electric bike, and I got that out of my system. A few weeks later, I biked on the Ohio Canal with my son. We did about 125 miles on a regular bike, and somehow I've concluded that riding an electric bicycle just doesn't seem like the right thing to do. I mean, if you're going to ride an electric bike, you might as well get a motorcycle. But let me share with you, the highlight of my trip was meeting one of my biggest fans of the show, and that is Reed from Nebraska. Reed and his family were on the road for 3 weeks, and we met on the Santa Monica Pier at the end of their journey. It was so wonderful meeting Reed and his beautiful family, and I want to give a huge shout out to his parents who took Reed on this road trip as a graduation gift from high school. Now, can you imagine if your child just graduated from high school and they asked for a trip down one of the most celebrated highways in the world? Can you imagine all of those great memories that everyone on that trip must have had for a lifetime to come? And let me tell you, Reed planned the whole thing himself. He showed me a list of all the stops during that 3-week journey, and he probably went to well over 100 stops, from historic motels and diners to the different alignments of the old road, must-see stops such as the Chain of Rocks Bridge and the statue of Andy Payne, and even one I didn't even know about, the Madonna of the Trail, which is a series of 6 statues stretching from coast to coast along the Old Trails Road. And for those of you who know me, as an educator, it just warms my heart when a youngster such as that has an interest not only in history, but in our beloved highway, which is a living history book. So, huge shout out again to his parents and many other parents out there and grandparents who have taken the time to take their children and their grandkids on this rich piece of history for future generations to cherish forever. And I have to share with you another highlight of this trip was me being silly, kicking my feet in the water in the Pacific Ocean, trying to get that great shot with the Ferris wheel behind me on the pier moving, and all of a sudden I hear, "Mr. Arno! Mr. Arno! Mr. Arno!" And I'm saying to myself, who would know me out here? Even if it was anybody related to the podcast, they'd be calling me by my first name. And wouldn't you believe it? It was a former student of mine who I taught in 5th grade. She's now in college. And I'll post that picture on the website. I'd like to thank my special group of Patreon supporters who are not only supporting this podcast, but the scholarship program as well. They include Mary Beth Busuttil from Florida, John B. from Rhode Island, Jim Crabtree from California, Mike Fort, Shelley Graham, Route 66 author and photographer, Kristen Hackinson from Washington, Rich Havlick from Minnesota, Mary Nicholson from Pennsylvania, Brian Sawyer from Indiana, Evan Stern from New York, and from the United Kingdom, Charlie Beaton, and from the Netherlands, Jim Renson. The business supporters for this podcast include the Midpoint Cafe in Adrian, Texas, the Jack Rabbit Trading Post in Joseph City, Arizona, and Gilligan's Route 66 Tours, providing travelers with guided tours of Route 66 in their own Ford convertible Mustang, accommodations at historic Route 66 motels, and breakfast every morning. For more information, please visit gilligansroute66.com. All Patreon members will receive an extended version of today's show, featuring additional stories about those who are buried at the GAR cemetery. My Patreon supporters will receive an additional 10 minutes of content from today's episode. Please check out my Patreon page to see all the different levels of support that are available that not only support this podcast, but the scholarship program as well, including maybe me showing up in your driveway in an RV to do our next episode. And now here's the trivia question for today's show. On the last episode, I featured the whole story behind the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre with noted scholar Scott Ellsworth. Here's the question. There are only 3 survivors from that 1921 event still living. How old is the oldest survivor? Well, the event took place exactly 100 years ago, but this survivor isn't just 100 years old, or 101, or 102, or 103. You get it. Let's just say they're even older than you would expect. The answer after today's show. My guest today is truly a resource along Route 66 and a place where you would never expect it. She's an office manager with the GAR Cemetery in Miami, Oklahoma, and she does a tremendous job at planning the annual remembrance ceremony to honor the British Cadets who are buried along Route 66 in Miami. And every year they have a ceremony, and this year it is scheduled for Saturday, October 23rd. Please welcome to the Route 66 podcast, Nancy Breaux. Nancy, how are you doing today?
I am fantastic. Thank you for having me on here today.
I'm so excited. Ever since I met you on my tour of Route 66, every other year I do the eastern and western half, so I probably met you 2 years ago. And you were so gracious. You gave me a whole tour of the cemetery, which is honestly something I didn't expect. Let's start with the GAR cemetery. What exactly is the GAR?
GAR stands for Grand Army of the Republic. And after the Civil War, several veterans got together and decided that they wanted to create a organization and have cemeteries around the United States that would give their comrades a place to be buried along with their family members.
And is it a public cemetery or is it just for veterans?
It was just for veterans, for the Union soldiers and their families in the very beginning. But our cemetery is unique because at the time that we took over, we opened it up to the public 100%. And we are one of the few GAR cemeteries that have both Union and Confederate soldiers buried out here.
And I guess this is new to me, but is it normal or typical to have tourists come to visit a cemetery in general?
Yes, we get tourists all the time.
Really?
I can't tell you how many times I talk to people, tell them what I do and where I work, and they very quietly, will say, I love going to cemeteries. They're so much fun, and I love reading the headstones. And I mean, it's amazing, and the popularity is definitely growing again.
So let's talk a little bit about the airport history with the Spartan School of Flying. How did it get established and how did it get located in Miami, Oklahoma?
Well, during World War II, the United Kingdom was having huge difficulties trying to get their cadets trained in their Air Force, because they no more than get up into the air and they get shot down. So they made arrangements with the President of the United States to where they would locate some British flying training schools here in the United States. They ended up signing on 7 locations in the beginning, but one was only open for just a few months and they closed it down because they had enough capability of training in the 6 locations that they ended up with. But basically, we had some very prominent people here in the local area that went to bat for the city of Miami and said, this is the perfect place. We've got an airport. We've got a place to build. We've got all the facilities that we can put up for you guys. And we want this training school here.
So the British cadets came to Miami between 1941 and 1945. Obviously, when they first came, we were not yet pulled into the war. Was it known around Miami what was taking place, or was this like a top secret activity?
Oh, it was absolutely not known. Only certain people knew about it. They instructed their cadets to come in civilian clothes. They were not to wear their uniforms out in public. But, their accents always gave them away.
How'd they get over that?
Yeah, but it wasn't too long, after they were in and getting set up. Of course, at first their barracks weren't built yet, so they housed them in different locations here in town.
What was the benefit? I'm sure it must have benefited economically Miami and the surrounding area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. In morale, it was the morale and the whole, it was just amazing. The welcome that the British soldiers got. We got more out of it emotionally than we probably did, monetarily, because our community supported these British boys 100%, took them into their homes, took them to Sunday's, church, had them over for Sunday dinners, took them to the local NEO ball games. There was just so much. And none of them felt out of place. They were, everything I've read from any of them, they've all said that the welcome that the community had given them was almost overwhelming, considering where they came from and what was going on in their homeland.
Absolutely, sure. And what was the number of cadets total that came in those years?
I am ready for that one. So the actual total that came through, I said I was ready, was 2,000.
Wow.
2,124 Royal Air Force cadets, 117 U.S. Army Air Force cadets, of which out of all of those, 1,493 pilots were awarded wings upon graduation.
Wow, that's incredible, along Route 66.
Mm-hmm.
And who trained these cadets? Were they servicemen, U.S. military, or were they locals from the Miami area?
Both, all of it. Yeah, we had locals that trained. We also had, people from the Spartan School of Aeronautics that come up to train. From all over the United States, even we had instructors that would be like, if they were in the military, they would be based at that number 3 British Flying Training School as an instructor. And we even had civilians, that lived here that knew how to fly, that, were instructors.
Right. So obviously these cadets come from the United Kingdom, which is in the war. They come to the United States, a foreign country, different accents. What were some of the other challenges that these cadets had to deal with in being in Oklahoma?
As far as challenges goes, of course, the accent, like you said, was probably the biggest one. But they came here in their wool clothes. I mean, the temperature is so much different here.
Right.
They weren't accustomed to the heat in the summer or the bitter cold in the winter. I mean, it was from one extreme to the other, different than their home country.
So at the GAR cemetery, there are 15 cadets buried there, plus one remarkable woman who we'll talk about. But if you had to pick one person you could meet, Nancy, of those cadets, tell us, who would it be and why?
Oh, my goodness. I would take any single one of them. They all have their stories. And unfortunately, we don't have all of their stories. I just couldn't, honestly, if I had to choose one, and it's only because of one particular reason, and that's because I know he has a son that would dearly love to meet him, and that would be Kenneth Raisbeck.
Yes, tell us that story.
So John Raisbeck, his mother was pregnant with him, about 6 months pregnant with him, whenever Kenneth left the United Kingdom and came over here to train. And then, of course, while he was here, his mother gave birth to him. But before he could graduate, he crashed in a flight outside of Oswego, between Oswego and Chautauqua, right close by here. And so he never got to meet his father. And at the age of 70, I think it was, he contacted me, called me on a cell phone, and started asking me questions and wanting to know if I knew anything. And so he said that he would love to come to one of our ceremonies. And he had been here at least once before at one of the reunions. And so I just started making arrangements.
Good for you. And what was that like?
Oh, it was amazing. Absolutely amazing. I think we gave him one of the most cherished memories he could have ever gotten. Because when he came, he was here for like 4 days. And whenever he came, we took him to the Oswego Historical Society. The gentleman there, Philip Blair, got to give him kudos. He's a great guy. Pinpointed from the obituaries and the newspaper articles where Kenneth Raisbeck crashed his plane, in what field. So we made arrangements to take John out to the actual field where his father lost his life. And we were out there for a few hours. And then the next day, we took him to the Dobbs Museum. And we looked through all of their pictures and photographs, and, there's scrapbooks that people have donated during the war. And one of them was pictures of the different courses. Well, in course 19, they had a picture of a plane crash, and there was only one plane crash in course 19, and that was Kenneth Raisbeck. So we are under the assumption, we can't prove it, right. But we are definitely under the assumption that that is the actual plane crash of his father, that he had no idea. He had no idea. He's 70 years old and never could find anything out, nothing about his father.
What an incredible story.
Yeah. So then the next day, the arrangement was to fly him over that crash site in an AT-6.
Oh.
Yes, sir. In the same exact kind of airplane that his father trained in and crashed and lost his life in, over his father's crash site. And it was extremely moving for him. So it's all of this is his symposium, and everything is on our website, and you can listen to his story. It's absolutely amazing.
How long have you been running these remembrance ceremonies every October at the GAR Cemetery?
I started here at the cemetery in 2012, and I believe the first one was in 2010.
And this is a big deal, Nancy. Tell us who your visitors are every year for this ceremony and what takes place.
Okay. We have our regular participants in the British Flyers ceremony. And every year I try to get a guest of honor. So basically our main one that comes every year, we've got a few that does a wonderful speech that keeps us entertained, and it's new and fresh and different every single year. I have to give him kudos. Derek Farrell, he is magnificent. He's with the Royal British Legion out of Tulsa. And also Squadron Leader Robert Jimmett. He is the liaison officer from the UK that is based at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. And of course, the city of Tulsa Pipes and Drums with their bagpipes. And it's just amazing. And all of the veterans organizations here locally, we have local churches. People are, they love to sing for us. I mean, it's just, I never have any problem getting people to come and participate.
So there are 15 cadets. How many separate accidents were there?
Oh, my. Okay. Well, I know 4 of them died in one single accident. 2 of them were in each one of the 2 airplanes, and they collided in midair and killed all 4 of them. One of them wasn't even in an airplane. The very first gentleman that died was in course number 1, and his name was Fred Tuft. But he walked into the propeller.
Wow.
And yeah, very tragic.
Before we move on, the Spartan Air School also trained Hal Halverson. And tell us who he was, very unique person who got his roots, his start.
Oh, yes. Colonel Gale Halverson, everybody called him Hal. Amazing man. Where do I start? He trained right here. He's from Utah. And he trained right here in Miami, Oklahoma, got his RAF, Royal Air Force wings, as well as his USAAF wings, fought in the war, survived the war. And then he was based over in Germany during the after effects, after the war was over, and they were doing the Berlin airlift, Operation Little Vittles. They took dry goods and stuff to the bomb-ridden country because Russia had blocked off all of the land inlets into that area. So they had to fly the provisions in, completely bombed. No fresh water in a lot of locations, definitely no power, or anything like that. And no food, a lot of orphans, and he was taking all this food to them. So he decided one day, he had a day off, he was going to take his camera and just walk around and take some pictures, him and another buddy of his. And they come across a group of kids. And he stopped and he talked to them. And by this time he had learned some German. And just talk to them for the longest time. And he has his own website out there, guys. And he's still alive.
Yes, he is.
Like 100 years old. He's still alive, but I could talk forever about this guy. But anyway, he met these kids. He talked to them forever. And he said, as he was leaving, he thought to himself, well, these kids never asked me for anything. You know how all the kids, they'll run up to the soldiers and they'll want candy and gum, And he thought to himself, well, they never asked me for anything. And he reached in his pocket and all he had were 2 sticks of double mint chewing gum. So he thought to himself, if I give these 2 sticks of gum to these kids, because there's so many of them, they're going to kill each other for it. He said, well, I've got to give it to him. So he tore the pieces of gum in half, and the kids took it, and they tore off little pieces. And the kids that didn't get any gum took the wrapper and was smelling the wrapper. That was their delight.
Wow.
They got to smell the wrapper. And it just touched him so deeply. And he said, you know, kids, I will be here. I will come across whenever I fly in tomorrow. I'll drop enough candy. I've got to be in the plane. I don't have the day off, so I'll drop enough candy out of the airplane for everybody. And they said, well, how will we know it's you? And he said, well, whenever I come over the tower, I'll wiggle my wings and you know it's me. So he gets back to the barracks and he gets a hold of all of his buddies and he said, I need all your candy rations. So they all gave it up and he made this big ball of candy. And he thought, if I throw this out of the airplane, it's going to fall on them kids and it might kill one of them. So I've got to figure out something else. So what he did is he got everybody's handkerchiefs, tied strings to them, made the little parachutes and dropped them out. And so all the kids come running and he dropped out all that candy. And he did this for quite some time. And he got wind that his commanding officer had found out that it was him. So he stopped doing it. And then one of the little girls got a message to him and asked him where their candy was. And, you know, that they didn't understand, you know, if he was okay or what was going on. So we thought, okay, I'll do one more drop. Well, someone was out there with a camera and they got a picture of him with his tail number and candy in little parachutes falling out of the back of his airplane. So he got called into his commanding officer's office, and he said, Halverson, what you been up to? Gail said, oh, nothing much, sir, just delivering dry goods. And he slapped that picture down onto his desk, and he said, well, from what I understand, you're doing a whole lot more. So anyway, make a long story short, the officer told him, he said, I don't care. You keep doing what you're doing.
Aww.
You are lifting the morale of the soldiers. You're lifting the morale of the citizens. And it's working and it's wonderful. And I don't want you to stop. So in the end, he had candy companies from all over the world ship him cases of candy. And women would send them their hankies drenched in perfume and lipstick kisses all over them. So, you know, if any of them kids or the adults now obviously have any of those handkerchiefs, they're quite a keepsake, I'm sure. But yeah, he's quite a man. And I think just last year he did another candy drop just this last year.
So that's the Candy Bomber, and when you visit our website, route66podcast.com, I'll actually have a link to a documentary about him.
Okay, wonderful.
So Nancy, in the spirit of Route 66, probably the most popular person buried at the GAR cemetery is Francie Frances Mae Hill. Tell us, Nancy, who was she?
Mrs. Hill, she was a dear, dear lady. She loved all of the cadets. She had grown an attachment to one of the cadets that ended up losing his life. And whenever she had heard about him passing and getting shot down, it just devastated her. But even before that, though, she just had such a big heart for these kids, you know, that were coming across the world. And she took them in like her own son. She attended every one of the funerals. From what information I have gathered, she never missed one of the funerals. And she would walk. She had a beautiful garden at her home, and she would pull flowers up, bulbs up, and she would walk along the railroad tracks from her house to the cemetery weekly, and she would maintain these British graves. For years. She did this for over 40 years until she got too elderly to do it any longer. never once asked for anything, from what I understand. She took everything out of her pocket or out of her own garden and tended to these graves of her own accord for over 40 years. Never missed a beat. And there was a gentleman that got wind of this and sent a letter to the United Kingdom, and she actually was awarded the King's Medal. So it was quite an ordeal, and we've got a monument in place stating that for her, and we celebrate her life and her accomplishments at every ceremony, and never miss an opportunity to tell her story, to people that visit here and come to see, people here at the cemetery.
So she's buried alongside these 15 cadets. Who decided to bury her alongside the cadets? Whose idea was that?
It was hers, beyond a shadow of a doubt. She insisted that she was to have her and her husband buried along at the end of those graves. So she actually purchased those herself and had her place set, picked out long before she passed away.
And tell my listeners who might be wondering, why should we have such an interest in maintaining these graves for these cadets in Oklahoma?
Everyone has a story, and I search deeply for everyone's story, including these 15 cadets from England. And not everybody has family locally, that can come and decorate and remember them and things such as that. But these 15 cadets are halfway across the world from their families, and their families cannot generally make it over here to remember them, to honor them, to respect them. And not only that, but we have numerous soldiers from our country that are buried over in England. And I can guarantee you, I know several people that honor our war dead over there in the same way as we honor theirs. And I think it's just the most respectful and honorable thing that we can do. We don't want anyone thinking that they're priority or more important than the other beloved people that are buried out here. But we do feel like they are just as important as everyone else. And, for the simple fact that they have no one. If we didn't decorate for them, no one would.
Absolutely. Well said. I'm curious, with all the cadets who came to Oklahoma, were there any relationships ever formed between a cadet and someone from Oklahoma?
Yes, many times. In the books that I read, I see all the time where there's announcements of marriages,
Wow.
things like that. As a matter of fact, one of the people that I met whenever I first worked here, Polly was her first name, sweet, sweet lady. She actually married a cadet and had a daughter. And then there was another person that married a cadet, and they ended up locating in Canada. That happened all the time. Many relationships formed while the cadets were here in the States, not just here in Miami, Oklahoma, but at all of them.
So when we were pulled into World War II, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, what happened to the daily operation at the Spartan Flying School? Was it still training British cadets, or now was it just for Americans?
No, when we got pulled into the war, they were the main people that were responsible for training the British and American cadets here, as well as they maintained their facility in Oklahoma City, down around Oklahoma City.
Nearby in Miami, Oklahoma, are there any museums that might have any of these letters or other items from the days when these cadets were training at the Spartan Flying School?
Oh, yes. There is two places that I know for a fact. And sometimes you can find stuff in the old, flea markets.
Really?
People will take stuff. And yes, it's amazing what you can find in the local flea markets. But the Dobson Museum has a little, I call it the treasure chest. It's just a little trunk that has a lot of information in it. Unfortunately, it's been pilfered through so much that, it's a little disorganized, but it's amazing information. And they have other things, pictures on the walls and things like that at the Dobson Museum. And then the other location is the NEO College, Northeast Oklahoma College here. It's a JUCO. In their library, they have a treasure trove of information that former cadets have donated to them. And it's all very organized and very, there's so much, just drawers of files of things from many different cadets and families of cadets.
And are there any original buildings still standing at the airport that Route 66 travelers can see?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Of course, they probably wouldn't know, unless they knew what they were looking for, what this building is. But it's the old hangar, the original old hangar. And I believe, and I've done some research, and I can't find any other original structures that we are the only one that have one of the original hangars still standing.
And how far is the airport from the cemetery?
Not that far. I mean, it's almost directly behind us. A couple of miles, maybe a mile, but that's as the crow flies. It takes, you have to go a different route to get to it. But on the way there, you would drive directly by the old hangar.
And for these cadets and for Francis Mae Hill, what does it look like at the cemetery? Are they all in one area?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, they're all in a row. Every one of them are all in a row.
So there's also other notable people buried at the GAR cemetery. Nancy, tell me who some of these people are. Richard Kelton?
Richard Kelton. He was an actor. He played in Bonanza and Charlie's Angels, I believe, and a few more.
George Coleman.
George Coleman. Wonderful man, very prominent in the community, was into mining. He actually owned and created and was over the structure building of the Coleman Theater.
Elvin and Lovell Mantle.
Elvin and Lovell Mantle. Wonderful people. They are the parents of Mickey Mantle.
John Beaver.
John Beaver was the second chief, and in today's terms would be like the vice president of the Quapaw Indians. He was buried on Indian land. His family purchased an upright statue made of bronze of his a liking of him, and they couldn't get it out to the property because they were all dirt roads and it was so heavy. So they had to disinter him from the family property, the Indian property, and bury him out here. So that is why we were blessed to have John Beaver.
And I remember when I met you, I asked you, who was that? It's like a 6-foot bronze statue from Italy, correct?
Yes, yes.
Alpha Carden.
Alpha Carden is the oldest known interment that we have out here. She was interred in 1892 when this was still Indian territory.
Charles Banks Wilson.
Charles Banks Wilson, a lot of people may know about him. He is a world-renowned artist that painted all of the big, huge murals in the tundra at the Oklahoma State Capitol building. He also has some amazing Indian architecture that is very well known.
And I'll have a link. There was a whole documentary on him. He's painted everybody from Woody Guthrie to Jim Thorpe and 65 Native Americans. And he's had work in New York and the Washington, D.C. museums.
Yes.
William Campbell.
Oh, Cal Campbell. He is a gentleman. He was a constable, and he was murdered by Bonnie and Clyde.
Wow, just one of 9 who were killed by Bonnie and Clyde. Booger Red.
Booger Red. So he's got an extremely interesting story. The Booger is actually his nickname, and he was given that nickname when he was a young boy. Him and a buddy put some dynamite in a tree, and it was like a false explosion. It delayed it, to explode, and he was up by the tree, and it boogered up boogered up his face, and his best friend said, "Boy, you sure are boogered up," and they just called him Booger Red from then on. But he was a bronc rider. Him and his family had their own Wild West show. He traveled the world with it, as a matter of fact, and never got bucked from a horse, from what the stories say. And he was in an unmarked grave for many, many years, until probably about 12 years ago. His actual true given name is Samuel Thomas Privet.
I like Booger better.
Yeah, Booger Red, 1864 to 1924. And on his tombstone, it says, "Have all the fun you can while you live, for when you're dead, you are long time dead."
That's true. That's true. And is it true that Booger actually rode over 25,000 Broncos and never ever fell off?
That's what his wife wrote. Yes, I have read that.
My visitors, if they're traveling Route 66, I know for sure when they go through Miami, they're going to want to stop at the Coleman Theater. And hopefully after listening to this episode, they'll stop at the GAR Cemetery. The website is very informative. It has videos of some of the cadets and other notable people who are buried there. How did you get involved in this type of work, Nancy? I can't imagine you would ever think you'd be scheduling remembrance ceremonies from World War II. How did you get involved in this?
It's kind of ironic you say that, because I tell a lot of people that I never in my wildest dreams ever thought, whenever I grew up, I wanted to work in a cemetery. It's true to my heart. It's how I got into this was just by accident. Honestly, it was just a position that was available, and I applied, and here I am 8 years later.
And there's so much history at the GAR Cemetery. So tell us again, what's taking place there on October 23rd of this year, 2021, or as an annual event every October at the GAR Cemetery?
At 10:30 in the morning, we will have our 11th annual British Flyers Remembrance Ceremony. We have regulars that come out to attend every year, and then we also have new people come every year. So it's growing, and we love that, and we hope to see it grow for many years to come.
Well, my guest today was Nancy Breaux at the GAR Cemetery in Miami, Oklahoma. Definitely include it on your itinerary if you're taking a trip across Route 66 and you're in the Miami area. Nancy, thank you so much again. I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure and my honor. Thank you so much for asking me to speak on behalf of the loved ones that are out here and our British cadets as well.
That's Nancy Breaux, who's the office manager at the Miami, Oklahoma GAR Cemetery. Thank you, Nancy. And when she said, when you get there, give her a call, she will come out and give you a one-on-one tour of the cemetery, just like she did with me. As a reminder, if you're a Patreon supporter, I have an additional 10 minutes of footage where Nancy talks all about the GAR Cemetery. And they're having their remembrance ceremony this year on October 23rd. And if you can't make it this year, it's an annual event every October. And now the trivia question for today's show. On the last episode, I featured the story behind the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre with Scott Ellsworth. How old is the oldest survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre? That would be Viola Fletcher, who was 7 at the time, making her 107 years old. She turned 107 this past May, and if you visit the show notes for this episode, you'll see her testifying before Congress this past summer. Next time on the show, it's a living icon on Route 66, who is currently the longest business owner along Route 66. It's Ramona Lehman, who's been operating the Munger Moss Motel in Missouri for the past 50 years. And here's a clip of my talk with Ramona. So Ramona, how does a farm girl from Iowa wind up with one of the most historical motels on Route 66?
One day in January of 71, we had a snow blizzard. It was waist deep, no matter where you looked. Next afternoon, he got back home. First words out of his mouth, "We're moving."
Oh.
We're moving south. A motel, we had talked about doing that once, or otherwise going out to Colorado and getting a big old cattle ranch, or, you know, how you dream.
Yeah.
Got here to Lebanon. The guys got to talking. Lo and behold, all of a sudden, I'm over on the other side of town, and we meet Pete and Jesse Hudson, who own the Munger Moss Motel. We went home, talked about it. We didn't have money. And got enough for a down payment. And right cracky, by the 1st of June, we were here.
Tell my listeners one thing you would want them to know about your late husband.
He was a very honest man. The name came from Mr. and Mrs. Munger, H.P. Munger. They had a fishing resort down on the Big Piney River. He died, and she met and married Emmett Moss. That's how you come up with the name Munger Moss. The name Munger Moss comes from. It's not a special moss or anything like that. And this little man walks in and says, "You're Ramona?" I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, I got something to say to you." And I thought, oh my gosh, what'd I do now? Anyhow, he says, "All I can say is you've done the names Munger and Moss proud. And I am so proud to know you. You didn't take the name and throw it away. You kept it, and you made something better out of it."
And I can't imagine how many times a day people stop by to take pictures.
A lot of them just drive up, roll down the window. Some come in, look around. Just traveling 66. I says, fine, you know. Like I said, it's not going to go away. It's going to stay.
Ramona, what's been the biggest challenge in the past 50 years of running the Munger Moss Motel?
I don't know. I think the early years.
So in June, there was a huge celebration at the Munger Moss celebrating the 50 years that you've been the owner and operator, along with your late husband, Bob. What was that like?
That was the most fun I ever had.
And have you traveled the entire length of 66?
Nope.
That's Ramona Lehman. And what you just heard is not just an interview with a living legend along Route 66, but in fact, an oral history account that will be available for future generations to hear firsthand what it was like by people who lived and worked along Route 66 at the peak of the highway. Lastly, before we say goodbye, for those of you who have enjoyed episodes here on the podcast where my guests are well into their 90s, such as the Angel Delgadillos of the world, I want to share with you another podcast that I currently host, and that's called the STEM Class Podcast. My latest episode features a 97-year-old woman who's a real-life Rosie the Riveter. That's right. During World War II, she worked in a Birmingham B-29 factory, updating those fighter planes. She later went on to earn her Ph.D. in education. That's My Talk with Dr. Francis Carter on the STEM Class podcast at thestemclass.com, or you could find a link on the show notes for this episode. Sadly, just a few weeks after I interviewed Dr. Carter, she passed at the age of 98. But she's an incredible storyteller, telling stories about what it was like growing up during the Depression and deciding to leave school to help out the war effort. Thank you for taking the journey with us here at the Route 66 Podcast. Please visit Route66podcast.com for detailed show notes and to see both current and past pictures and videos that were featured on today's show. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with someone else who might enjoy learning all about the history of Route 66. I'm your host, Anthony Arno. Be well.